Привет. Since winter's ending in a couple of days, I figured it was appropriate to talk about a goddess who's got a whole bunch of different names all throughout the Slavic world. The Poles called her Marzanna. Morana was her name in Slovenia and in Serbia and Croatia. She was called Murava in some places. More in Lithuania. Morena in Slovakia and Macedonia, Mora in Bulgaria. The Rus called her Marena. Ukrainians and Czechs call her Mara. That's what I'm going to call her. She's the goddess of winter, more specifically like the death of winter, and she's seen as a bringer of death. Sometimes she's associated with the night, sometimes associated with unhappy love, which to me is like very oddly specific. Her name is based on a Slavic root word, mor, which is used for confusion, peril, nightmare, death, plague, a bunch of bad stuff. So perhaps she's also a bringer of nightmares. And hey, if you're a bringer of death, why not nightmares too? There's a story of Mara as a bringer of death, which, you can kind of see where at one point Mara seduced Dajbog, the sun god. Well, that didn't last, and after Dajbog moved on to another lover, Mara poisoned him as payback. In retaliation, Dajbog ends up burning Mara and he banishes her to Nav, which was the underworld in Slavic mythology. And so this retaliation thing kind of coincides with the movement of the sun throughout the year. It's a belief of the ancient Slavs that the sun descended into the underworld in the winter. So in this sense, like Mara's quite literally winter. And then Dajbog manages to free himself from her embrace and he breaks free in springtime. A lot of traditions point back to her role as the goddess of death. There was another tradition that states that she wasn't always the embodiment of death, that she was once a goddess of fertility and of life, and she ended up withering, and as she withered, she became an evil, deadly old crone. And this kind of makes sense as far as, her name originating from the word death in a lot of different languages. But apparently she was once a goddess of life with that same name. So what does Mara look like? She's supposed to be a woman of terrifying appearance, pale skin, long dark hair. Sometimes she's got claws and fangs of a wolf. And she's kind of connected in some ways to a Germanic demon, Mare. Basically, another nightmare thing. Come and sit on your chest in the night until you suffocate. In other traditions, she's a young maiden dressed all in white. To most, she's going to show up as a withered old woman with an ugly face, but if you're not afraid of her, she will appear as a beautiful maiden. Mara's rites survived into Christian times. They're still being done as a form of play, I guess, in a festival called the Maslenitsa. And it's like a 6 or 7 day feast that's celebrated in March. During the first 5 or 6 days of Maslenitsa, flat blini, think pancakes or blintzes, get served. And they're supposed to, symbolize the sun. Oh, and I've got to include this. One of the other traditions of Maslenitsa, the men in the village form 2 lines and just punch each other. Good times. On the last day, a straw effigy called Goik, standing for winter, gets made. The goit can range in size from a puppet to a life-size dummy. The rite involves preparing the effigy wrapped in white cloth. Remember, sometimes Mara shows up dressed in white and adorned with ribbons and necklaces. Traditionally, the goit has been carried past every house in the village by a group of children holding green juniper twigs. During this procession, Mara gets repeatedly dipped into every puddle they run into or every stream. In the evening, the effigy gets passed to the young adults, the juniper twigs get lit, and illuminated Mara gets carried out of the village, burned, and thrown into water. If there's no lake or pond nearby, the effigy is burned, its clothes get ripped off, or it has been pelted with snow or mud. Now, you gotta have traditions and superstitions that are going to be related to the custom of drowning Mara. Once she's in the water, or once the effigy's in the water, you can't touch it, otherwise your hand's going to wither. Looking back while returning home, that's going to cause illness. Stumbling or falling, that can lead to a relative's death. Give a combination of these together, and you're going to get that usual dose of sickness and plague. Forever intertwined, Mara, goddess of winter and death, and maybe night and maybe nightmares, and Vesna, goddess of spring and rebirth. They can't exist without each the other. However, they can't possibly exist in the same place at the same time either. They are the forces that kept the ancient Slavic world turning in a cycle of death and rebirth. One goddess, loved for her beauty and bounty, the other feared and hated for her ugliness and darkness. Modern traditions are an echo of how these two were once celebrated and ritually murdered, and they show how interconnected the goddesses were and continue to be. So in these ancient Slavic rites, the death of the goddess Mara, that signals the end of winter, and then that signals the rebirth of the goddess Vesna, or it could be the goddess Lada, which I'll get into in another video. And both of those goddesses represent spring. And there's a ritual that takes place, like after dumping Mara in the water, or tearing her clothes apart or whatever. The procession that comes back, from the village or back to the village, they return home with bouquets of green twigs called gaik. Kind of like the name they give the effigy. And the procession would go from house to house. Okay, the church isn't really keen on this ritual, and so they tried to forbid it. I know that like in Poland in the 14th century, they were like, really, don't do that. And in the 18th century, they tried to basically take over the ritual and say, hey, the Wednesday right before Easter, we're going to throw an effigy from the church tower. And that effigy is really Judas. That didn't catch on. So rituals continue today, and now this festival is more like a festival of fun, and hey, everyone's having a good time. Well, I hope you stick with me for the next installment on Slavic mythology and Slavic folklore.